About 1 year ago, I was driving home from the store late one night. I lived on the outskirts of a small town, not completely isolated, but far enough out that the nearest grocery stores and restaurants were about 10 minutes away. After shopping at 2 different stores to get my groceries, I headed home. Everything was normal until about 5 minutes into the drive. I was on a quieter, rural road with not many other cars around. That's when I noticed a vehicle behind me. At first, it wasn't a big deal, but it began to drive closer and closer until it was right on my bumper. The speed limit on that road was 55 miles per hour, and I was already going close to 60. The car could have easily passed me since the road was clear and open, but instead, it just stayed on my bumper. I had noticed the headlights earlier when the car was farther back, but I hadn't been paying much attention until it got so close. All I could tell was that it looked like an average sedan, not much different from my own. It was too dark to see who was driving. I decided to speed up a little, hoping they'd back off, but they sped up too. When I turned onto another road, I thought maybe they'd go their own way. But to my frustration, they followed me. To test if they were really tailing me, I turned onto a random quiet street, and they did the same. I circled back onto another road, and then onto the busier one I had been on earlier. Each time the car stayed right behind me. By this point, I was sure I was being followed, but I couldn't think of any reason why. I hadn't cut anyone off or done anything unusual while driving. There hadn't even been that many cars on the road to begin with. That's when I remembered hearing advice about driving to a police station if you think you're being followed. I grabbed my phone, typed police station into the GPS, and followed the directions. It was about 5 to 10 minutes away, and the car stayed on me the entire time. When I finally pulled into the police station parking lot, the car behind me put on its turn signal, as if it was going to follow me in. But at the last second, it turned the signal off and kept driving past. I let out a huge sigh of relief. I sat in the parking lot for several minutes, making sure they were really gone before heading home. To be extra cautious, I took a longer route back and kept checking my mirrors to see if anyone was behind me. When I finally made it to my quiet street, my relief was short-lived. As I approached my driveway, I saw a car parked there with its lights off. It wasn't my car, and to my horror, it looked like the same vehicle that had been following me. Panicking, I didn't pull into the driveway. Instead, I drove down the street, turned around in a neighbor's driveway, and drove away. As I passed my house again, I saw the car's headlights suddenly turn on. Not wanting to be followed again, I immediately sped off, turned onto a busier road, and made several quick turns. This time, I didn't see the car behind me. I drove straight back to the police station and went inside to talk to an officer. After explaining what had happened, the officer agreed to follow me back home. When we arrived at my house, the car that had been in my driveway was gone. The officer told me to call them if I saw anything suspicious again. Thankfully, I never did. To this day, I wonder who that was and how they knew where I lived. This happened more than 15 years ago. I was driving home with my girlfriend after spending the evening at my aunt's house in Springfield. It was Christmas Eve, and my mom's family always threw a big party that night. My girlfriend had never met my family before, so I was a bit nervous about how she would feel being around so many new people. But to my relief, she fit right in, chatting easily with my aunts, uncles, and cousins. They all seemed to like her, and she genuinely seemed to enjoy herself. We spent most of the afternoon and evening talking, playing cards, opening presents, and having a few drinks. By the time we had to leave, my girlfriend was pretty tired, so I was the one driving us home. It was around 11 p.m., and I was driving her car. This part of the road was surrounded by farms and thick patches of forest, with some stretches that didn't have streetlights. But I wasn't worried. I grew up around here and knew the road like the back of my hand. We were just driving and talking, 2 young people enjoying each other's company. There's a part of the highway that goes down a long, steep hill before crossing over a creek. On both sides of the road, there are dense, dark woods and no lights anywhere. The only thing we could see was the patch of road illuminated by our headlights. As I drove down the hill, crossed the bridge, and started uphill again through more forest, something suddenly darted across the road so quickly that I almost hit it. I slammed on the brakes, and then I turned to my girlfriend and asked if she saw it too. She said she did, but she couldn't tell what it was. We both wondered if it might have been a coyote since they're common around here. Still, something about it felt off. Coyotes don't usually run out in front of cars like that. For some reason, I decided to check it out. I turned the car around and switched on the high beams to light up the woods where it had gone. I stepped out of the car and walked toward the forest, but I didn't see anything. After a few moments of searching, I started to feel uneasy. The area was dead quiet. Then suddenly the car's horn blared loudly, and not just a quick honk, but a long, continuous blast. I rushed back to the car and asked my girlfriend why she honked like that. She didn't say anything but pointed to a spot about 50 feet away from where I had been standing. I followed her gaze, and that's when I saw it. Standing there, partially hidden by the trees, was a man. He was filthy, covered in dirt and mud from head to toe. In one hand, he held a hatchet. His wild, disheveled appearance sent chills down my spine. He stared at us for a moment, then gave a creepy, almost mocking smile and waved before turning around and disappearing back into the woods. We were both frozen with fear, but quickly snapped out of it and sped off. Once we were safely back on the road, my girlfriend told me what had happened. While I was out of the car, trying to spot the man, he had actually circled around and emerged from another part of the forest, out of the reach of our headlights. She had caught a glimpse of him out of the corner of her eye. He was walking toward me, his hatchet raised. That's when she honked the horn to warn me. When we got home safely, we immediately called the police. They came out to check the area but never found anyone, or at least they didn't tell us if they did. The officer we spoke to said it was possible the man was trying to ambush someone who was alone. We all agreed that my girlfriend's quick thinking probably saved my life that night. It was late summer of 2009. I was almost 19, hanging out with my best friend, who was a few years younger than me. We lived in a very rural area of southeastern Kentucky, about 14 minutes from Middlesboro, Tennessee. Around here, pretty much everything closes by 10 p.m., so you have to find your own ways to pass the time. That was never a problem for us. We could always come up with something fun. The night started out harmless enough. First, we went to the mall, then cruised around town looking for something interesting. Typical stuff teenage guys would do. When that didn't pan out, we decided to go bowling until the lanes closed. Afterward, we drove over to Main Street just before midnight to walk some of the back alleys, acting like the edgy badasses we thought we were. But we never really felt like we were in any danger. Violent crime was almost unheard of in our area. After we walked around for a bit and got bored, we decided to grab a bite at Waffle House, pretty much the only late-night dining option back then. Once we ate and made a quick stop at Walmart, we still weren't ready to head home. So, we set out for a drive down some backcountry roads. This was nothing new to us. Like I said, around here, you have to make your own fun, and late-night drives were kind of our thing. The stretch of road we ended up on was one I'd only driven maybe once before, during the day. It wasn't far from where either of us lived, but we just never had any reason to go down it. While still in Tennessee, the road was paved, but within a mile it crossed into Kentucky and turned to dirt. Like most dirt roads around here, the county didn't pay it much attention. It was way out of the way and had very few houses on it. The road was prone to washing out in heavy rains, so we had to drive slowly. Since we weren't familiar with it, we crawled along even more cautiously. At first, it just felt like any other quiet rural road. Around here, at this time of night, the roads are almost always empty. With only a handful of houses scattered along the road, we were sure we wouldn't run into anyone. The road was mostly wooded and sat at the base of a small ridge. At night, the houses were easy to miss. If not for a light we spotted out of the corner of our eyes. We slowed down and noticed a man standing under his porch light. We couldn't make out any details about him, but we could tell he was watching us. He didn't move except for his head, which followed us as we passed. That immediately put us on edge. At first, we thought he might just be stepping outside for a cigarette, but something about his demeanor felt off. Nothing happened with the man, but it was enough to make us uneasy. We gradually picked up speed and tried to shake it off. A few minutes later, the road ended, and we found ourselves back on a paved route I was much more familiar with. It was a relief. We could drive faster and put some distance between us and that strange encounter. The road we were on now ran along the top of a ridge, offering a beautiful view of the town below. After a couple of miles, we reached the end and turned onto another road that led back toward my house. This stretch was more wooded, but I'd driven or ridden it thousands of times. As we made our way back toward the main highway, we saw something ahead in the distant reaches of my headlights. Deer are a constant hazard around here, so we assumed that's what it was and slowed down. But as we got closer, we noticed it was much whiter than a deer's typical brown fur. We thought maybe it was an albino, which wasn't unheard of. But as we approached, it became clear this wasn't an animal at all. It was a person, hunched over, walking in the left lane, facing traffic as they should. My friend muttered, "What the hell are they doing walking out here at this time of night?" As we got closer, I could make out more details. It was an older woman, with long, scraggly gray hair, wearing a white t-shirt and white pants. She kept her back to us until we were about 50 feet away. Then, she suddenly turned to face us. Her appearance was unsettling, to say the least. She looked gaunt, with deep eye sockets, heavy dark circles, and greasy hair. Her skin was weathered and aged. If I had to guess, I'd say she was in her mid-50s. But the worst part was her behavior. She threw her hands into the air and started waving them frantically. Then she began running toward us. That's when we saw the blood. Dried stains covered the front of her shirt and pants. And in her hand, she clutched what looked like a large knife. Whatever desire we had to act like tough guys vanished instantly. I floored it, and we didn't slow down until we hit the highway. A quick drive to my house, which should have taken 5 minutes, turned into a 30-minute detour. We couldn't shake the irrational fear that somehow she'd find a way to follow us. In small towns like this, you tend to know everyone, but neither of us had ever seen this woman before, or since. We watched the local news in the following days, hoping for some explanation. A report about a bloody woman being picked up, anything, but there was nothing. Fast forward to today, I now live with my wife on the Ridge Road between those two backcountry roads. I take the latter road daily, and I've never seen any sign of that strange woman again. Earlier this year, though, there was a major drug bust on the road where we saw the man watching us. I've often wondered if that was the same house, and if he had been guarding something illegal back then. As for the woman, I still don't have an explanation for what we saw that night, and honestly, I hope I never see her again. I was attending a popular concert in the south side of Atlanta last year. As most of you probably know, it's a pretty rough area, and the crime rate is pretty high. But the tickets were really cheap, and the concert was well populated, so I felt relatively safe. Plus, I decided to go with a couple of my friends. The concert was amazing, and we all had a great time. But we knew the drive out would be rough with all the traffic. By the time we got out of the parking lot and onto the main road, it was already close to 10 p.m. We quickly realized we were going to be stuck in this traffic for a while, as the cars were barely moving. While sitting there, my friends started looking up alternate routes to get back to our town. They found one that seemed like it could get us past all the congestion. After sitting in the same spot for almost 30 minutes, we agreed to give the alternate route a shot. As soon as we could, we turned off the main road and began driving through some neighborhood streets. Strangely, there were a lot of people outside, even this late at night. Some were walking around, while others were just standing in their front yards. This wasn't normal for us, coming from a quieter area a couple of hours west of here. As we continued through the neighborhood streets, we started to notice something weird. The people outside were watching us as we drove by. Then it hit us. We hadn't seen another car in nearly 20 minutes. This made us all a little uneasy, and we began paying more attention. I asked one of my friends to check the map for the nearest main road. While he was scrolling through his phone, my other friend pointed out something strange. A car parked sideways at the end of the street, blocking both lanes. I stopped the car immediately and backed out, returning to the previous road. From there, we tried to continue, hoping to find a safer, more public area. But just a few seconds later, we saw another car, again parked sideways at the end of the road, blocking both lanes. I stopped again, and we all exchanged nervous glances. It was too dark to tell if anyone was inside the car ahead of us, so we didn't want to risk approaching it. While we were discussing what to do, two men emerged from one of the houses nearby. One of them walked behind the car, while the other came up to my driver's side window. He motioned for me to roll the window down. Feeling nervous, I rolled it down just a few inches. The man leaned in slightly, scanned the inside of the car, and asked, "Where are you headed?" I replied, "Just trying to get back to the highway." He nodded, then glanced over at his friend, who was now walking toward the passenger side of the car. There was a brief, tense moment where everything seemed to go silent. Then, out of nowhere, both men grabbed the car doors and started trying to force them open. I reacted as fast as I could, throwing the car into reverse as everyone inside screamed. One of the men tried to reach through the gap in my window and got his arm stuck for a second as I reversed. He ended up hitting the ground hard as I floored it out of there. I turned the car around and sped back the way we came. We were all in complete shock. My hands were shaking uncontrollably as I tried to stay calm and focus on driving. We all agreed to get back on the main road we came from, even if it meant sitting in traffic for hours. That situation could have ended so much worse, but thankfully our doors were locked. A few years ago, I was a truck driver. My job was to deliver goods across the country. I enjoyed driving at night because there were fewer cars on the road, and it felt peaceful. One night, I had an urgent delivery that took me through a small, quiet town in Tennessee called Clearfield. The town was eerie, with old wooden houses and dimly lit streets. As I drove through, I noticed a young woman on the side of the road, hitchhiking. She had long, dark hair and was wearing a white dress. Against my better judgment, I decided to pull over and offer her a ride. She got into the truck and thanked me in a soft voice. She told me she was trying to get home to see her family. At first, everything seemed normal. We made small talk and she shared stories about her family and how much she missed them. But as the drive continued, things started to feel strange. The temperature in the truck dropped noticeably. I turned up the heat, but it didn't seem to help. Then the radio began acting up. It started switching stations on its own and playing static. The more I talked to the woman, the more inconsistencies I noticed in her story. She said she lived in Clearfield, but when I asked her for an address, she couldn't tell me. When I pressed for details, her demeanor shifted, her voice became sharp, and her eyes looked wild. Then suddenly she vanished. One moment she was sitting in the passenger seat, and the next she was gone. I pulled the truck over to the side of the road, frantically looking around, but there was no sign of her. My heart pounded as I tried to process what had just happened. I decided to keep driving, desperate to get out of that town. But as I drove, I started seeing her again, first in my rearview mirror, standing by the side of the road, and then in the middle of the street, staring at me with those same wild eyes. I swerved to avoid hitting her, but when I looked back, she was gone. My hands were shaking, and I could barely keep my eyes on the road. Then, without warning, she reappeared, right there in the passenger seat. Her face was pale, and her eyes were hollow. I was terrified but tried to focus on the road. That's when I remembered hearing stories about Clearfield. People said the town was haunted. There was a legend about a young woman who had died years ago in a tragic accident. She had been hitchhiking on this same road, trying to get home to her family, but she was hit by a car and killed. They said her spirit still roamed the area, trying to find her way home. It dawned on me. The woman in my truck was her. She was the ghost from the legend. I felt a mix of fear and pity. She wasn't trying to hurt me. She was just lost. Then she spoke. Her voice was soft and full of sorrow. She said, "I want to go home." I asked her where her home was, but she didn't answer. She just stared at me with those empty eyes. I decided to keep driving, hoping I could somehow help her find peace. The temperature in the truck dropped even further. I could see my breath, and the radio continued playing static. The road seemed endless, and the darkness felt oppressive. Finally, I saw a sign for a small cemetery just outside of town. I pulled over and stopped the truck. I turned to the woman and told her we were there. For the first time, she smiled. She thanked me, got out of the truck, and walked toward the cemetery. I watched her until she disappeared into the darkness. The temperature in the truck began to rise, and the radio returned to normal. I felt a mix of relief and sadness. I hoped she had found peace. I continued my drive and made my delivery, but I've never forgotten that night. The memory of that young woman has stayed with me. It was a chilling reminder that there are things in this world we can't explain. Now, whenever I drive through small towns late at night, I think of her and hope that her spirit has finally found its way home. The road can be a lonely place, but sometimes it holds secrets far beyond our understanding. This happened to me back in 2015. I was 20 years old at the time, and this experience was just really off-putting. I'm from Florida, and I live in the suburbs, about 30 minutes outside Orlando. I've always thought of where I lived as being particularly safe, so when this event happened, I was totally shocked. It was about 1 in the morning, and I was driving home from my uncle's house. My family tends to stay up really late, so we usually hang out well into the night. I was debating whether to take the main road home, which is more well lit at night, or drive through an area called Whispering Pines, which is a lot less lit but faster. I drove down the long road and turned into Whispering Pines, then began driving. There's this small bridge I have to cross that leads me to a stop sign near my neighborhood. As I went through the windy roads of the suburbs, I could see the bridge in the distance, but it looked like it was closed off. It seemed as if a hazard gate was blocking it. You know, the ones that reflect when your headlights hit them. I also thought I saw someone standing there, wearing a tan outfit, waving at me. I assumed nothing of it and figured the bridge was just out. But as I got closer, I realized what I saw wasn't at all what I thought. First, it wasn't a gate. It was actually toilet paper stretched across the bridge. And the officer I thought I saw. Well, it wasn't an officer. It was a shirtless man wearing a sack over his head, with 2 eye holes cut out. He was waving a machete at me, almost like he was saying hello. Yeah, you got me messed up if you think I stayed around to see what was going to happen next. I threw my car into reverse so fast, made a U-turn, and floored it out of there. As I was speeding back up the road, I noticed another car coming down towards the man. Strangely, it didn't seem to follow me back out. I didn't care at that point. I called my mom, who told me to call 911, which I did, and I can't make this next part up. As I was on the phone with the police, driving back on the main road, I saw a car accident on the opposite side of the road. There were 2 bodies lying out on the street, with officers standing over them. It was like something out of a nightmare. Needless to say, I was glad when I finally got home. But I didn't get a wink of sleep that night. I know this isn't the scariest story out there, but imagine driving down a dark road at 1 in the morning and casually seeing a man in a sack mask waving a machete at you. A lot of people might say, oh, I'd hit him, or I'd get out and fight him, but let's be real. We all know we'd be making the fastest U-turn of our lives. Not to mention, I honestly think that other car coming down the road was probably a friend of the man. Maybe they planned to jump someone like me, just an innocent person trying to get home.